Hey everybody, I'm not sure that this is working right. If it is, if you're hearing me, give me a comment here. My title just went away, my app crashed. And Rustlin, what's up? You guys hear me good and clear? My title, my video today, I don't even see it here. It just looks like it's a blank video. It's why do people hate jazz? Anyways, welcome to only some like jazz. Okay, so you guys actually know, you see the title there? Okay, great, perfect. Man, there's a lot of people on here. Look at that. People hate jazz because it shows their limitations. This is going to be a long video. Let me talk. Greetings. Yeah, everybody tell me where you're from too, by the way. Hard rock fans hate jazz. I don't know if that's necessarily true. It's interesting. But welcome to all the new people that subscribed. Had some really big videos over the last 2 weeks or so. And got thousands and thousands of new subscribers. So welcome to all you new people that have just subscribed. It's Labor Day here in Atlanta, and I'm laboring here. Actually, I'm not laboring. But welcome to all of you new people here, and jazz is great. I'm trying to look at all these comments. They're coming so fast. It's really crazy. Fusion rules. So I did a clinic with Victor Wooten over the weekend. His Wooten Woods beautiful 150 acre. I'm not sure what you'd call it actually. It's like a compound. I mean, it's unbelievable. And got to hear Stanley Jordan play. I don't know any of you if you're familiar with Stanley Jordan. I just played Aaron Stanley Jordan. He had never heard of him before. Stanley's a phenomenal guitar player that was really big in the 80s, jazz player. I got to hear Danny Gottlieb, who was the drummer of Pat Metheny's early group from 77 to 83. Amazing drummer. And Victor and his brother Joe were there, and it was really, really great. And we talked about this subject. I brought it up at dinner. I was sitting there with Victor and Bob Franceschini, and that this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And we'll talk about Walter Becker too here. Anyways, it's really interesting to hear the opinions of people that are professional jazz musicians, to hear their opinion on it. I did a little bit of research here before this. I like to talk about these statistics before that I think are really kind of pertinent to this. So I looked up how many jazz records have gone gold and platinum since the beginning of jazz, and there have been 9 platinum records. Platinum is 1 million selling records, or selling 1 million records. There have been 34 records that have gone gold or platinum in the history of jazz. Kind of Blue is the biggest selling jazz record of all time. It came out in 1959. It went 4 times platinum in I think 2004. Okay, so that's a multi-platinum record, 4 million copies. The number 2 is Vince Guaraldi's Charlie Brown Christmas. That is 3 times platinum, and that came out in 1965. Herbie Hancock, Headhunters, I think was the record next. It came out in 73. It went platinum in 1986. Then Heavy Weather Report came out in 77. It was certified platinum in 1991. I remember that being a really big record at the time. Future Shock, Herbie Hancock, which is not really a jazz record, but we'll put it in that category. That came out in 1983. Dave Brubeck, Time Out, came out in 1959. And that was a gold record, or that's a platinum record, I'm sorry. Ken Burns' jazz compilation is platinum. Louis Armstrong, Wonderful Life, is a compilation from 1988, so there's two compilations there. And then Bitches Brew by Miles came out in 1970, and it went platinum in 2003. Those are the 9 platinum releases. Out of that, there are 25 gold records. Out of that 25, Miles has a couple more that are in there. Sketches of Spain is one. Coltrane has a couple records in there, like Love Supreme and Blue Train are gold records. Pat Metheny has 2 records in there, Still Life Talking and I think Letters from Home are both gold records. But nobody's had a gold record really in, well over 20 years. It's people don't buy records anymore anyways. People don't buy complete records, but in order to have a number 1 jazz record nowadays, you have to sell about 1,200 records at the most. If you went back to the mid 80s, you'd have to sell probably 30,000 records to have a number 1 record. You probably could have a number 1 record without selling even 1,000 copies, depending on the week you release it in. So just about anybody could release a jazz record, and if you have enough friends, you have a number 1 jazz record. So why is that though? Why do people hate jazz now? If I put jazz in the title of one of my videos, people don't watch it. If I put improvisation in the title, people will watch it. Now, people are saying, why is Snarky Puppy so popular? Probably because of the way that they present themselves. Not only the music, but it is the way that they present themselves. If you look at some of their videos, they're really hip. You see, it's young people, or at least people in their late 20s, early 30s that play really hip grooves and incorporate new genres of music in with their fusion. So I would say that I would say that people don't like jazz just because they don't understand improvisation. Essentially, because you're speaking a language, it would be like me listening to Chinese, which I don't understand, and trying to enjoy it. If you have no context for it, like, I wonder if when I'm listening to something, when I listen to a jazz guitar player, if I listen to George Benson, I say, okay, I hear that. That's coming from Wes Montgomery. That's coming from Charlie Christian, from Django Reinhardt. That's an original line that's a George kind of line, or this is coming from Kenny Burrell or whoever George might have been inspired by. So that's a big thing, is actually understanding the context of what they're playing in their improvisations. It's really, really important to know and have a background in it. Very few people like jazz that don't understand jazz, unless they get into it for the groove. Jazz was really big during the big band era when people danced to it. And then once it broke off into bebop in the mid 40s, people stopped dancing to the big bands, and they started to dance to new rock and roll with Chuck Berry and all the big 50s artists. Then Elvis came on the scene. Then obviously the Beatles came on in the early 60s. And rock and roll became the dance music up until people started couldn't dance to rock music. And jazz really probably hit its peak. If you look at these dates of these platinum records, There's nothing, if we discount the Ken Burns compilation, Louis Armstrong compilation, there's nothing before. There's Future Shock by Herbie, but that's really not a jazz record. Everything else is in the 70s. And you have some gold records, like I said, of Pat Metheny that were from the mid 80s. So, anyways, that's essentially, in my opinion, why jazz is not big anymore. People don't dance to it. People don't understand the language of what people are speaking, essentially. So, that's kind of that's my personal opinion about why jazz isn't famous anymore, or why jazz isn't successful anymore. Now, there's many jazz albums and jazz artists that you'll go out and see, and they'll sell a lot of records, or they'll sell a lot of tickets live. Not a lot of records, but they'll sell a lot of tickets live. I saw Pat Metheny play 6 months ago here in Atlanta, and he sold probably 1,700 tickets or so at Symphony Hall, but there was no one under 50 years old there. If you go to a jazz club here in town, it's all old people there. So, yeah, that's just one of the things that is really depressing. I think that jazz musicians too have never never were good sonically with what they were doing. They a lot of them didn't know what the cool sounds were using. If you listen to a lot of 80s jazz, a lot of the keyboard sounds that came out were really cheesy sounding. And people just, when you listen back to those records, they sound incredibly dated. So, and I just saw a comment there, jazz is alive in Europe, and I definitely agree with that. The European audiences are much more sophisticated, and frankly, in Asia, in Japan, places like that, they're much more interested in listening to jazz. Or down in South America, if you go to Brazil, that has a much more sophisticated ear for harmonic progressions. Brazilian music historically has been much more complex than American music, or music that has become big in America. So, anyways, I think that that's my personal opinion on it. I want to talk about a couple things. Speaking of jazz, Walter Becker passed away over the weekend. Those of you that don't know Walter, he was the guitar player and other songwriter in Steely Dan. Steely Dan was a massively big band here in the 70s up until 1980. Their first record came out in 1971, Can't Buy a Thrill. Their records were not as jazz influenced, the early records. They had a lot of improvisation in them, but they didn't become they didn't become jazz as really influenced until their middle period when they had Kid Charlemagne came out. That was if you know that Larry Carlton guitar solo in there, that's very much of a jazz solo in the middle of a rock tune. And the chord progression on that is much more sophisticated. But when you got to the Asia record, which came out in the late 70s, it got really, really sophisticated, their music, and much more like jazz in the chord progressions. Even in the soloing, and they used more jazz musicians, like Wayne Shorter plays on the tune Asian, Steve Gadd. You started to see more jazz players show up. The early record, the first record, Can't Buy a Thrill, which has Reelin' in the Years and Do It Again, which were two of Steely Dan's biggest songs, were not really jazz influenced at all, other than the type of soloing that they were doing. Do It Again actually was really a great, I say, kind of a modal jam. That's a great example. I always forget to mention that when I think of modal songs that do it again. Denny Diaz plays the guitar. It's like a sitar solo, but it's really played on a guitar. It's a phenomenally good solo. So those two, Asia and Gaucho, I just saw somebody put that up there. Those two records were really probably the most jazz-oriented, but it started happening in the middle period of Steely Dan, when you'd had Katie Lied and Pretzel Logic, records like that, that you would start to getting those more sophisticated chord changes, and they'd have more jazz players playing on them. But Walter was he was a massively big influence in progressive music and in, a proponent of jazz music in popular music in the 70s and all the way through, and probably into the 80s. He was 67 when he passed away, so I wanted to acknowledge that. I think it's that Steely Dan was the really fusion of jazz and rock music that happened, and one of the only fusions of jazz and rock music. That I think was really truly successful. If you listen to things that come to mind when people use jazz musicians in their band, like Sting, for example, during his Dream of the Blue Turtles record that came out in 1985, it was his first post-Police record, and he had all jazz players. So he had Branford Marsalis and Kenny Kirkland on keyboards and Omar Hakim on the drums, and who played bass in that band? Daryl. It was all jazz musicians for the most part. Branford and Kenny Kirkland being the most straight ahead. Daryl Jones, thank you. That was a really sophisticated group there of players, but they weren't jazz records though. Even though Sting had records or had songs like Fortress Around Your Heart, which had a very sophisticated harmonic progression, but it wasn't jazz. But that, I would say that was that was kind of an homage to jazz, or it used jazz players in a different way, but to play rock music. Steely Dan really incorporated jazz chord progressions, major 9 chords, no thirds, to dominant sharp 9 chords, or the minor 7 sharp 5 chords, right? It's like I call it a quartal voicing. So it'd be if you did something like A quartal, so A, D, and G over B, that kind of a voicing. That's Steely Dan. That was really kind of part of their later vocabulary. If you listen to the beginning of Josie, really sophisticated chord progression in the beginning of that song, and for things that were on the radio, that was super sophisticated. Somebody just said here, Robert said, Robin Ford's trying to keep jazz alive. The thing that Robin Ford was able to do is he's able to create a fusion of the two genres. And blues never has gone out of style. That's one of the things that I always talk about. Blues music never goes out of style. And one of the reasons that I think that rock has suffered since the mid-90s is that the blues left rock music. And I think that people, when they became disconnected, when rock music became disconnected from blues, people stopped listening to it. There was no historical connection to it. And Robin Ford incorporates jazz really well. He's one of the few players that incorporates jazz vocabulary in with blues. And he's one of the few guys that really makes it work. You'll see people like, Joe Bonamassa that will play lines that sound more like Eric Johnson and that are really sophisticated on that level, but they're not jazz at all. There's really very few jazz elements to it. Guys like Guthrie Govan, he will play some jazz style lines. Those of you that are familiar with his playing, he will play some more sophisticated, more sophisticated harmonic devices, but are really not jazz. If you hear him play Donna Lee or something like that, he doesn't play it like a jazz player. His swing feel is not like a jazz player. So it's hard to really find people that can blend those two styles together. You know, John Scofield was able to blend his blues elements in the records that he did. He did with that used more kind of jam band sounds or jam band grooves that he would play over it, that he'd use blues oriented lines along with his more sophisticated vocabulary. He was able to do it, but he had already made his name as a jazz musician. So other than that though, people hate jazz. When I put jazz in the title of a video, the videos do terribly. And I never could figure out why. I always it kind of just goes along to my theory that people hate jazz. But then I asked the question, why do people hate jazz? So I don't know. I'm throwing that out there because I'm curious to get people's question or people's thoughts about that. Is it somebody just said jazz is math in music? Is that good or what? Allan Holdsworth uses jazz vocabularies, but Allan Holdsworth uses really almost modern classical vocabulary in the chord progressions, and he solos like a jazz player but with a rock sound and with rock parts. So that was really fascinating about Allan. But was Allan ever accepted by the masses? No, of course not. Never. He had an extremely hardcore following, me being one of them. But did he ever sell, 500,000 records? No. Did he ever sell 200,000 records? I don't think so. I really doubt it. I would be surprised if any Allan Holdsworth record sold 100,000 copies. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think. And I'm talking about back in the day when people actually bought records still. We're talking, people bought records up until probably 2004, 2005. But I think that people just don't connect with that music for some reason. They don't connect with the vocabulary, with the different modulations, the chromaticism. I'm not saying all people, but I'm saying a lot of people don't, especially people here in the United States do not connect with it anymore. When I was playing jazz music in the 80s, it was big. I mean, it was still big. I remember people would come out to shows all the time to hear improvised music in the mid-'80s, all the time. And I noticed the drop-off starting to happen around 1991. There was really a pinnacle in jazz that I would say probably was till about 1986 or so. And then it started to go down. Now, I have a couple theories here that I want to float. One of them is that jazz players want to get paid for whatever gig they do, and they have no allegiance, most of them, to any one particular band. If we look at bands on this list of successful records, at least in sales, you have Miles Davis being one of them, John Coltrane another one, Pat Metheny another one, Weather Report another one. Well, what did they all have in common? They had the same people in the groups, okay? Miles had a quintet in the 50s and a different one in the 60s. They were the same people that would play on record after record after record, and they had a vibe that they created, and people expected that sound. The musicians grew with the music. The sound of the group grew with the music. Weather Report. Pat Metheny had the same band from 1977 until 1983, essentially. I think they added Steve Rodby in 82 or so. But Danny Gottlieb, who I said I got to meet this past weekend at Victor Wooten's camp, he came and did a seminar. And I didn't get a chance to talk to Danny for very long, but I wanted to actually ask him about this, and I'm going to do an interview with him, a sounding off, and talk to him and get his opinion on this, because he's one of the few people that are from those groups. So you had Coltrane had a group. If you think about with Elvin, his group in the '60s, that was kind of the thing. But and you could say Chick Corea's Electric Band had a lot of the same players. People like groups, but most jazz players want to just get paid for their gig and go play with the next person that can pay them. That's kind of that whole jazz mentality. It's like, okay, people used to pay a sideman back in the 80s. They would say, okay, I'm going to pay you $5,000 for the session to do this record. And they pay every guy $5,000, let's say, to make a jazz record. And that was it. They'd come in, they'd rehearse for one day, they'd make the record, and they'd be done. They'd go on and do their own thing. Unless you were a really big name. If you were Herbie, I'll give you another example, Keith Jarrett. What about the trio with Gary Peacock and Jack DeJohnette? How long was that together for? The first record, First Standards Volume 1, came out in the mid-'80s. They were out playing until a couple years ago, until Gary Peacock retired. He's in his 80s, but that group was together for 25 years and put out many, many, many records. People knew what to expect with it. It was a group. It was a group of people that communicated on a super deep level, and it was something that people could relate to, because it was the same people interpreting music together over a long period of time. And if jazz players would actually create bands, they would be much, much better to, I think that they would actually have much more success, with their record sales and with their live performances. Another thing that I talked about when I was talking with Victor this weekend was that we were talking, and I presented kind of a theory seminar or a theory clinic for an hour or so to the group of people there. It was really, really fun. But we talked about the idea of not recording. So no one was allowed to record at this, allowed to record any of the lectures or anything. And I talked about people that I've interviewed, like Scott Henderson, for example. When I interviewed Scott, I wasn't able to interview him on camera, but he says he doesn't allow people to tape his shows. The same thing with Pat Metheny. When you come out immediately, Pat says they have a person come out before Pat plays now. And I haven't seen Pat play in 25 years, but they say no recording devices. Put your phones on hold, put them away. Nobody's allowed to record. Well, that's why there's nobody under 50 years old at these gigs, because young people discover music and want to go see it live by seeing people and what the experience is like. And one of the things, somebody asked me if I listen to Fish. I worked with Trey Anastasio back in 2005. I did a record with Trey called Bar 17. And I remember when I first met Trey, he asked me if I had seen Fish play, and I said, yeah, I saw Fish play. I saw Fish play a couple times, but I saw him play in 1988 at a place called The Haunt in Ithaca, New York. And Trey remembered playing there. That was one of the first, there was in upstate New York, and Fish was really big in upstate New York. And they played, the club only held probably 250 people or so. This is right at the beginning of Fish. So everybody knows that a big thing about Fish and the Grateful Dead is they encourage people to record. Well, why? That method of people sharing that live experience through tape and then through video is what gets people to come to the shows. But I don't know why jazz people don't realize that. And I think part of Pat Metheny's thing is that he's a perfectionist. This is my own, this is not from talking about this, but just from reading the things that he says about it. He doesn't like a lot of the solos he plays, even though I think they're great. And he wants to have complete control over what is put out there. So you can't, jazz, somebody says, was jazz ever really popular? It was very popular in the 1930s in the 1920s and 30s. It was the pop music. So I think that if jazz players would let people record them and would encourage it even, it would help them tremendously. It would help them actually bring in young people because, I don't know how you're supposed to bring in people into your live experience if people don't ever see you play live. So just simply take the model of the Grateful Dead and Fish. That works. There's a reason it works. They play different sets every night. They play different jams all the time. They encourage people to tape. People traded tapes, and they had massively big followings live, and always did. Even now with John Mayer going out with the Grateful Dead, I mean, Jerry Garcia's been dead for 25 years, and John Mayer goes out and plays, and the Grateful Dead sells out every show still. Fish sells out every show still. So the Dead was very jazz influenced. Well, they were an improvisation-based group, and like Fish is. And if those bands can do it, why is it that the jazz musicians can't do it? Well, one of the reasons goes back to my same point. The Grateful Dead had the same players in it, and Fish had the same players in it, still do. They're bands. There's a personality that of the band that actually is that people, they look to those individual players. They become familiar with them. They would like to emulate certain players. I was lucky enough to, I got to jam with Trey and John Fishman. The first day that I met Trey, we went up to the barn that he used to own. I don't know if he still owns it anymore, up in Burlington, and we jammed for 2 hours on one song. And it was really fascinating. They loved to jam. We played the same song for 2 hours. That's pretty much a jam. And when I worked on this record with Trey, I mean, some of the tunes would go on for 50 minutes. We had to disable the thing in Pro Tools that only lets you record for 10 minutes at a time because we never knew how long the songs would go on. I remember one tune that Trey, one jam that we did on that for that record was 53 minutes long. It's the longest recording I've ever been involved with, and it was really fascinating to work on and to work with Trey on that. I'm trying to read these comments. They come by so fast that it's almost impossible to follow them. I'm trying to read some of these things now. Yeah, an hour-long jam. Dear Lord, exactly. Oh, man. I don't even know what these... let's see. Rob evolved to find out... fourth chord, okay. Jazz shows, there aren't the spectacle that other genres have. Look how Garth Brooks transformed country live shows. Well, there's no question that jazz is not... With the exception of Pat Metheny always presented his shows like a rock musician. Everybody in the band had long hair. He had a light show. That was a huge part of it. He had songs that had melodies to them. He played incredibly melodically. And when you went to a Pat show, it was like seeing any other rock band at the time, except it was all improvised. Or it wasn't all improvised, but it was, the solos were all improvised. And it looked like a rock show. Guys with long hair playing music, the lead guy playing guitar. Eventually they added vocals when Nana Vasconcelos joined the band on the Off-Ramp record, I believe it was. Or maybe I think he started playing with them on As Falls Wichita, So Falls Wichita Falls. I think that he's on that record. I could be mistaken. But another band, the Becker Brothers, okay, that was a band that was a band. Although I wouldn't say it was like Metheny's group, in that Metheny's group played 300 gigs a year and had the same band for many years, for at least almost 7 years had the same band. So if jazz players had kept doing that, I think it would have made a really big difference. Allan Holdsworth kept some of the same people on his records, but not really. I mean, he had Gary Husband play on some records. He had Chad Wackerman play on records. He had different keyboard players play. He had some core players like Gary that played with him over the course of years, but still made records really infrequently and didn't tour like Metheny did and didn't tour like Weather Report. It was interesting. Victor, we talked about whether he saw Jaco. He never got to see Jaco play, and he was a huge Jaco fan. And he asked me if I saw Jaco, and I'm 2 years older than Victor Wooten, and I said, yeah, I saw Weather Report play. I saw them play a couple times, but I saw them play in Rochester, New York at the Eastman Theater, and I want to say 1978 or so, with Jaco playing, and it was amazing to have seen Jaco. And Jaco left the band in the early 80s and was never really that Jaco after probably he did the Shadows and Light tour with Joni Mitchell, and then his kind of mental health began to deteriorate after that. So, the Jaco documentary. I see somebody just put that up there. The Jaco documentary, absolutely fascinating. The only thing about it that I didn't like was the fact that they didn't ask Pat Metheny anything, because I think he refused to be in it, honestly. There's no reason that he shouldn't have been in it. One of the reasons that people know Jaco is because of the Bright Size Life record, Pat's first record. If it wasn't for that record, Jaco was, that came out in 75. Jaco was born in 51, so he was 23, 24 when the record came out. And that's the first time that a lot of people heard of Jaco. And then he had his first solo record that had Portrait of Tracy on it and Donna Lee. I want to say it came out in 76, right after that. And then everybody knew who Jaco was in the mid-70s. And then Weather Report. That was, he was as famous as anybody. I mean, he was incredibly famous. He was a rock star. He was a bass player. I mean, go figure, right? That a bass player was famous. It wasn't just like, it was a jazz player that played fusion also, that played on stage with Joni Mitchell and played bass solos. Somebody says, why would Pat Metheny refuse to appear on the documentary? I have no idea. But the fact that Bright Size Life was never even mentioned and Metheny was not interviewed tells me that he just didn't want to do it for some reason. That he was bent out of shape about something. I mean, I'm just assuming, I don't know Pat, but something must have, he must have had some type of negative experience with it that he did not want to be associated with the movie. And I don't know why, because it seems really odd. And to omit that had to have been on purpose, because Jaco didn't just come up from Florida. He came up to Boston. He made this record. They toured with Bob Moses. That was part of the Bright Size Life. It was Pat Metheny and Bob Moses on drums and Jaco. And I had read that there was a lot of pressure. I think Bill, I'm trying to think of the Jaco documentary that came out. Bill Milkowski, was that who wrote it? I believe they said that Pat was getting pressure from Manfred Eicher, who ran ECM Records, to use Dave Holland, who was an ECM artist and a great bassist on it. And Pat kind of went back and forth and then decided to use Jaco, who he knew from when Pat was down at the University of Miami. But that was a glaring omission in the movie. And I don't think it was Robert's fault that he didn't have Pat on there. I think that Pat probably did not want to be on it. So that's, once again, that is part of the, that unwillingness to be part of a group, I think is always been an incredible hindrance in jazz musicians. Been a hindrance to the whole style in general. And, people that started groups did much better if they used the same players all the time. like I said, go back and look at the people. Miles would have different keyboard players on different records in the 50s, different, not different players really in the 60s. He'd have a couple different horn players play, but generally it was Wayne and Herbie and Tony Williams and Ron Carter. I mean, that was pretty much his group. So those were the core players, anyways. Red Garland, yeah. So in the 50s group, you had Red Garland, you had Wynton Kelly, you had he would have a couple different drummers. I want to say Kenny Drew is on a couple records in addition to Philly Joe Jones, but for the most part, it was the same group, the 50s quintet. You know, he had Coltrane on it, but he had Cannonball as well. And sometimes Cannonball is not on the record and Coltrane is, sometimes vice versa. I'd have to think of specifically the records, but there was the core group of Miles in the 50s was a solid group. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. I've struggled with jazz mainly with more trying to associate with jazz players and being met with some awful egos. If technique was the problem, playing heavy metal will turn off most young people. Metal isn't as complex as jazz, but requires a lot of technique. Mark Lettieri, yes, I love Mark. Jazz players are like mathematicians who are very hard to get them to work in a group setting. Yeah, that's totally right. I keep seeing Vinny Colaiuta come up here. Vinny, I think the first time here was when somebody said Vinny in regards to Sting, and Sting used Vinny to play on a bunch of the Sting records. And after I want to say after the Fragile record, or Nothing Like the Sun. Is that the name of the second solo record? It was Dream of the Blue Turtles, Nothing Like the Sun. And then I want to say that Manu Katché played on one of the records, and Vinny played on. I think they split the drumming on one of the records, and then Vinny played on a bunch of records after that. Vinny's an amazing player. One of my favorite drummers. I was lucky enough to play with Vinny a number of times in the mid '80s, and he's just mind-boggling, the stuff that he plays. And 10 Sumner Tales, Mercury Falling, those are the ones that Vinny's on, I believe. Yeah. So I think that, even Sting realized that on the first two records, he kept the same group, because Sting came from a rock person's idea of presenting a band, and he presented the same people. And it wasn't just the first two records. He had Bring on the Night, which was a live album, which is a great album. It's got one of my favorite Sting solo songs on there called I Burn For You. That live version that's on Bring on the Night is amazingly good. It's a great use of a flat six on a minor chord, the melody. You guys should listen to that. Listen to I Burn For You from the Bring on the Night soundtrack, and listen to the melody of the verse. It's an incredibly good melody. It's a great example of an Aeolian melody. Wayne Shorter understood the band thing as well. Exactly. Wayne totally gets that. The guys that were in the bands got that. They got the importance. Wayne got it because he played with Miles, and he knew how important it was to have a steady band, because people want to get familiar with the individual players, and they want to have that ensemble experience. Even I'm trying to think that so you had Chick's electric band. Chick had a band called did a three quartets record that came out around 1982 or so, with Eddie Gomez, Mike Brecker, Steve Gadd, and Chick. And that was a phenomenal band that they should have done a lot of records with that. I was lucky enough to see them play. They played in Ithaca, New York, of all places, for some reason. They only played a few gigs, but that was one of the best shows. That three quartets, yeah. That was one of the best shows I ever saw. Oh, man, smoking. It's unbelievable. It was really an eclectic group, too, because just that group of musicians was super interesting to see play together. I don't think people want to be, what's this say here? I don't think people want to be part of a band because it doesn't have their name on it anymore. Exactly, right? Metalcore equals jazz, maybe progressive math metal. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. My gent video that I did the other day, it's funny, do you gent, right? And Misha Mansour left a comment on there, and he goes, nice job. People are saying, that's not gent, you're not playing on an 8-string guitar or whatever. Well, he actually plays that tune, Marigold, on a 6-string. I think he plays on a 6-string Ibanez. And I picked that particular riff. I didn't want to do a kind of a typical gent chugging kind of song. I didn't want to do that because I wanted it to have some type of harmonic information to present to people, because I talked about the theory. People are like, oh, you didn't talk about the theory about it. So yeah, I had the music there with the notation and talked about the chord progression. You don't always have to talk about things. You can actually just look at them. And I have the free download for anybody that wants that PDF of that video. So look at it. It's really interesting what he's doing, the kind of chord progressions that he's using in that. I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's gone on in metal. I think a lot of people too were saying Rick Beato, he likes metal, and I've produced metal bands that's how I made my living. Hard rock, metal, things like that. You see all these 100-watt heads in the background here? That's why I own all these huge heads. And it's funny now because all the metal bands use all direct sounds, and they use axe effects. And I'm going to do a video for all you metalheads out there. I want to do a video where I compare the axe effects and the Kemper and their sounds, like when these guys are using the EVH guitar sound compared to an actual EVH, and show you that. I know a lot of people record with modelers and things like that. Or profiling amps, whatever you want to call them. They record with them because they're easier, number one. They don't have a big studio with a big room where you can actually crank the stuff up. I have a bunch of 412 cabinets that I have mic'd up all the time. Well, not all the time because they're not mic'd up here, but I'm going to walk in. I'm going to show you guys here. Let me see if I can get by this because I got a cable in the way here. Hold on. So I'm about to walk into my ISO booth here. It's going to get dark. Don't freak out anybody here. See, so I've got some cabinets set up here that I mic up all the time. I've got this Marshall here, which has 25-watt Celestians. It's a 100-watt cabinet. This Mesa cabinet has vintage 30s. The orange has vintage 30s. And this Marshall cab here has 65-watt Celestians that are phenomenally good sounding from the... I want to say it's from, they make reissues, but I have a cabinet that I filled with speakers that I got out of other cabinets in the, from 79 to 81, I believe they made the 65-watt Celestians, and they're amazingly good sounding. I know this is way off topic, but for those of you that are guitar players out there, okay, so my 100-watt cabinet has the greenbacks in it, 25-watt Celestians, the greenbacks. But the lower cabinet has a 65-watt speakers in it, the 65-watt Celestians, and they sound incredibly good. If you have a really bright amp and you want to tone down the top end of it, unbelievable. They're one of the juiciest, fattest, chunkiest sounding cabs because they're not like the 75-watt Celestians that you see a lot of metal bands use, which I think can get really woofy and not have the kind of mid-range detail that you want, or that I would want out of an amp. I think that that those 65 watts ones just sound incredibly well. Also, I want to do some more videos. I'm going to do some more production videos on this, but the grill cloth even makes a huge difference. The cane grill cloth that Orange uses actually cuts a lot of the top end off. Also, the construction of the cabinets, for example, the Mesa cabinet's a little bit deeper. So that has a completely different sound quality to it. I've got a few more 412s in this back room too that have different speaker combinations in them. And you can take the same cabinet, you can take the same speakers, you can take vintage 30s and put them in 4 different cabinets and get 4 different, completely different sounds. So you guys are not locked in with, I guess you've changed topic. Yeah, so I just wanted to, I don't know why it came to mind, but I want to talk about that. I'll talk about that in a later video. Do you use open back cabs for different things? Yes, I use open back cabs for, I have a Vox AC30 back here. I have a Fender Deluxe. I like open back cabs for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is that you can actually mic the back speakers. You can mic behind the amp and put the microphone out of phase. So a lot of times I'll put a 57 on the front, and then I'll go through the back of the amp and I'll put a 421, Sennheiser 421, and it gives it a bump at about 150 hertz, which is where there's a lot of energy in the guitar. If you ever hear chugging, if you're palm muting, a lot of that, the woofiness that comes from palm muting happens around 140, 150 hertz. If you want to pull that back, you need to dip that frequency there. Anyway, so that's my little jazz improvisation that I just went off. I went off into speakers there for a second. You see, my videos and my live streams are like jazz improvisations. I start with an idea, and then it kind of can morph into another idea, and then into another idea. And I go off. When you guys write something here, it makes me think of something different. It's like, oh, he played a 13 flat 9 chord, so I'm going to play something here. Oh, wow, that's really cool. He's doing that sub chord change. So, anyways, as a normal guy, Leonardo says, as a normal guy, I find jazz too random most of the time. I think that's a function of not understanding the language, because when I hear my son Dylan speaking Chinese, it sounds like Chinese to me. I don't understand anything. It sounds random. He knows what it means, and other people that speak Chinese know what it means. But to me, it just sounds like gibberish, and that's the only analogy I have for jazz. And I hate to say that you need to have a background in music to enjoy it, because my dad loved jazz and loved really sophisticated jazz and knew nothing about music. He loved bebop. I mean, really sophisticated bebop, and had no background in music at all. He didn't know a major chord from minor chord or anything. I mean, he didn't know anything. He just loved the sound of bebop. He loved the melodies, which is probably why I like them too. There's probably a genetic component to this too, that likes angular melodies and likes chromaticism. But I started out listening to rock bands. I listened to the Beatles and the Stones and Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Pink Floyd, and all the same thing that a lot of you started out that are my age. And then I ventured into jazz when I started hearing people that use chromatic notes. I was like, whoa, what is that? Wow, oh, that's cool. I like that. And my dad bought me Joe Pass Virtuoso, and I tell that story. But the more information that you have at your fingertips, and the more that you study and listen to any genre, you just become used to it. I mean, it's just like that. Okay, so that's my spiel today on this. Let me know in the comments. Leave me comments on some of the other topics you want to see me talk about. I've got some. I have some new. What do we call them, Aaron? What do we call them? I got some video. What is that? Courses. I have some video courses coming out. I have a course on the modes of the major scale. I have a course on film scoring coming out. This will be offered through my website. They're not only are they series of videos put together, but they're also interactive. And you sign into the website, you get your own password and everything, and it will do. There's exercises it'll do. There are quizzes, things like that. And we're working on the my ear training series, which is I'm hoping to have finished within the next couple months or so. But it's going to be pretty. I'm pretty stoked about it. So, anyways, you want to learn to hear polychords? You want to hear anything that you hear on a on your film score, and you want to know what it is, you take my ear training course. You're going to be able to hear all that stuff. You say, I know exactly what that. Oh, I know what that is. Oh, I know what that is. Anyways, all right. Please leave me a comment. Tell me where you're from. Tell me what you want to hear me talk about in my videos coming up. And I defer to you. That's all for now. I'm Rick Beato. Thank you all for watching. It's been great today. And have a great rest of your holiday weekend for those of you that are enjoying Labor Day. Take care.